This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kim Zuckert. Tales of the Brass Hedgehog, hedgehog.net. Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield. Chapter 8. Betsy Starts a Sewing Society. Betsy and Molly had taken Deborah to school with them. Deborah was the old wooden doll with brown painted curls. She had lain in a trunk almost ever since Aunt Abigail's childhood, because Cousin Anne had never cared for dolls when she was a little girl. At first, Betsy had not dared to ask to see her, much less to play with her, but when Ellen, as she had promised, came over to Putney Farm that first Saturday, she had said right out, as soon as she landed in the house, "Oh, Mrs. Putney, can't we play with Deborah?" And Aunt Abigail had answered, "Why, yes, of course. I knew there was something I kept forgetting." She went up with them herself to the cold attic and opened the little hair trunk under the eaves. There lay a doll, flat on her back, looking up at them brightly out of her blue eyes. "Well, Debbie, dear," said Aunt Abigail, taking her up gently, "it's a good long time since you and I played under the lilac bushes, isn't it? I expect you've been pretty lonesome up here all these years. Never you mind. You'll have some good times again now." She pulled down the doll's full ruffled skirt, straightened the lace at the neck of her dress, and held her for a moment, looking down at her silently. You could tell by the way she spoke, by the way she touched Deborah, by the way she looked at her, that she had loved the doll very dearly, and maybe still did a little. When she put Deborah into Betsy's arms, the child felt that she was receiving something very precious, almost something alive. She and Ellen looked with delight at the yards and yards of picot-edged ribbon sewed on by hand to the ruffles of the skirt, and lifted up the silk folds to admire the carefully made full petticoats and frilly drawers, the pretty soft old kid shoes and white stockings. Aunt Abigail looked at them with an absent smile on her lips, as though she were living over old scenes. Finally, "It's too cold to play up here," she said, coming to herself with a long breath. "You'd better bring Deborah and the trunk down to the south room." She carried the doll, and Betsy and Ellen each took an end of the old trunk, no larger than a modern suitcase. They settled themselves on the big couch, back of the table with the lamp. Old Shep was on it, but Betsy coaxed him off by putting down some bones Cousin Anne had been saving for him. When he finished those and came back for the rest of his snooze, he found his place occupied by the little girls, sitting cross-legged, examining the contents of the trunk, all spread out around them. Shep sighed deeply and sat down with his nose resting on the couch near Betsy's knee, following all their movements with his kind, dark eyes. Once in a while, Betsy stopped hugging Deborah or exclaiming over a new dress long enough to pat Shep's head and fondle his ears. This was what he was waiting for, and every time she did it, he wagged his tail thumpingly against the floor. After that, Deborah and her trunk were kept downstairs where Betsy could play with her, and often she was taken to school. You never heard of such a thing as taking a doll to school, did you? Well, I told you this was a queer old-fashioned school that any modern school superintendent would sniff at. As a matter of fact, it was not only Betsy who took her doll to school. All the little girls did, whenever they felt like it. Miss Benton, the teacher, had a shelf for them in the entryway where the wraps were hung, and the dolls sat on it and waited patiently all through lessons. At recess time, or noon, each little mother snatched her own child and began to play. As soon as it grew warm enough to play outdoors without just racing around every minute to keep from freezing to death, the dolls and their mothers went out to a great pile of rocks at one end of the bare, stony field which was the playground. There they sat and played in the spring sunshine, warmer from day to day. There were a great many holes and shelves and pockets and little caves in the rocks which made lovely places for playing keep house. Each little girl had her own particular cubbyholes and rooms, and they visited their dolls back and forth all round the pile. And as they played they talked very fast about all sorts of things, being little girls and not boys who just yelled and howled inarticulately as they played ball or duck on a rock or prisoner's goal, racing and running and wrestling noisily all around the rocks. There was one child who neither played with the girls nor ran and whooped with the boys. This was little 6-year-old Lias, one of the 2 boys in Molly's first grade. At recess time he generally hung about the school door by himself, looking moodily down and knocking the toe of his ragged, muddy shoe against a stone. The little girls were talking about him one day as they played. "My, isn't that Lias Brewster the horridest looking child?" said Eliza, who had the second grade all to herself, although Molly now read out of the second reader with her. Mercy, yes, so ragged, said Anastasia Monaghan, called Stashie for short. She was a big girl, 14 years old, who was in the 7th grade. He doesn't look like as if he ever combed his hair, said Betsy. It looks just like a wisp of old hay. And sometimes, little Molly proudly added her bit to the talk of the older girls, he forgets to put on any stockings and just has his dreadful old shoes on over his dirty bare feet. I guess he hasn't got any stockings half the time, said Big Stashie scornfully. I guess his stepfather drinks 'em up. How can he drink up stockings? Asked Molly, opening her round eyes very wide. Shh! You mustn't ask. Little girls should know about such things, should they, Betsy? No, indeed, said Betsy, looking mysterious. As a matter of fact, she herself had no idea what Stashie meant, but she looked wise and said nothing. Some of the boys had squatted down near the rocks for a game of marbles now. Well, anyhow, said Molly resentfully, I don't care what his stepfather does to his stockings. I wish 'Lias would wear 'em to school. And lots of times he hasn't anything on under those horrid old overalls either. I can see his bare skin through the torn places. I wish he didn't have to sit so near me, said Betsy complainingly. He's so dirty. Well, I don't want him near me either, cried all the other little girls at once. Ralph glanced up at them, frowning, from where he knelt with his middle finger crooked behind a marble ready for a shot. He looked, as he always did, very rough and half-threatening. "Oh, you girls make me sick," he said. He sent his marble straight to the mark, pocketed his opponent's, and stood up, scowling at the little mothers. "I guess if you had to live the way he does, you'd be dirty. Half the time he doesn't get anything to eat before he comes to school, and if my mother didn't put up some extra for him in my box, he wouldn't get any lunch either, and then you had to go and jump on him." "Well, why doesn't his own mother put up his lunch?" Betsy challenged their critic. "He hasn't got any mother. She's dead," said Ralph, turning away with his hands in his pockets. He yelled to the boys, "Come on, fellers, beat you to the bridge and back," and was off with the others racing at his heels. "Well, anyhow, I don't care. He is dirty and horrid," said Stashie emphatically, looking over at the drooping, battered little figure, leaning against the school door, listlessly kicking at a stone. But Betsy did not say anything more just then. The teacher who boarded round was staying at Putney Farm at that time, and that evening, as they all sat around the lamp in the south room, Betsy looked up from her game of checkers with Uncle Henry and asked, "How can anybody drink up stockings?" "Mercy, child, what are you talking about?" asked Aunt Abigail. Betsy repeated what Anastasia Monaghan had said, and was flattered by the instant, rather startled attention given her by the grown-ups. "Why, I didn't know that Bud Walker had taken to drinking again," said Uncle Henry. "My, that's too bad." "Who takes care of that child, anyhow, now that poor Susie is dead?" Aunt Abigail asked of everybody in general. "Is he just living there alone with that good-for-nothing stepfather? How do they get enough to eat?" said Cousin Anne, looking troubled. Apparently Betsy's question had brought something half forgotten and altogether neglected into their minds. They talked for some time after that about 'Lias, the teacher confirming what Betsy and Stashie had said. "And we sitting right here with plenty to eat and never raising a hand," cried Aunt Abigail. "How you will let things slip out of your mind," said Cousin Anne remorsefully. It struck Betsy vividly that 'Lias was not at all the one they blamed for his objectionable appearance. She felt quite ashamed to go on with the other things she and the little girls had said, and fell silent, pretending to be very much absorbed in her game of checkers. "Do you know," said Aunt Abigail suddenly, as though an inspiration had just struck her, "I wouldn't be a bit surprised if that Elmore Pond might adopt 'Lias if he was gotten at the right way." "Who's Elmore Pond?" asked the schoolteacher. "Why, you must have seen him. That great big, red-faced, good-natured-looking man that comes through here twice a year buying stock. He lives over Bigby way, but his wife was a Hillsboro girl, Matey Pelham. An awfully nice girl she was, too. They never had any children, and Matey told me last time she was back for a visit that she and her husband talked quite often about adopting a little boy. Seems that Mr. Pond has always wanted a little boy. He's such a nice man. 'Twould be a lovely home for a child." "But goodness," said the teacher, "nobody would want to adopt such an awful-looking little ragamuffin as that 'Lias. He looks so meeching, too. I guess his stepfather's real mean to him when he's been drinking, and it's got 'Lias so he hardly dares hold his head up." The clock struck loudly. "Well, hear that," said Cousin Anne. "9 o'clock and the children not in bed. Molly's most asleep this minute. Trot along with you, Betsy. Trot along, Molly. And Betsy, be sure Molly's nightgown is buttoned up all the way." So it happened that, although the grown-ups were evidently going on to talk about 'Lias Brewster, Betsy heard no more of what they said. She herself went on thinking about 'Lias while she was undressing and answering absently little Molly's chatter. She was thinking about him even after they had gone to bed and had put the light out, and were lying snuggled up to each other back to front, their 4 legs crooked at the same angle, fitting in together neatly like 2 spoons in a drawer. She was thinking about him when she woke up, and as soon as she could get a hold of Cousin Anne, she poured out a new plan. She had never been afraid of Cousin Anne since the evening Molly had fallen into the wolf pit, and Betsy had seen that pleased smile on Cousin Anne's firm lips. "Cousin Anne, couldn't we girls at school get together and sew? You'd have to help us some, and make some nice new clothes for little 'Lias Brewster, and fix him up so he'll look better, and maybe that Mr. Pond will like him and adopt him?" Cousin Anne listened attentively and nodded her head. "Yes, I think that would be a good idea," she said. "We were thinking last night we ought to do something for him. If you'll make the clothes, Mother'll knit him some stockings, and Father will get him some shoes. Mr. Pond never makes his spring trip till late May, so we'll have plenty of time." Betsy was full of importance that day at school, and at recess time got the girls together on the rocks and told them all about the plan. "Cousin Anne says she'll help us, and we can meet at our house every Saturday afternoon till we get them done. It'll be fun. Aunt Abigail telephoned down to the store right away, and Mr. Wilkins says he'll give the cloth if we make it up." Betsy spoke very grandly of making it up, although she had hardly held a needle in her life, and when the Saturday afternoon meetings began she was ashamed to see how much better Ellen and even Eliza could sew than she. To keep her end up, she was driven to practicing her stitches around the lamp in the evening, with Aunt Abigail keeping an eye on her. Cousin Anne supervised the sewing on Saturday afternoons, and taught those of the little girls whose legs were long enough how to use the sewing machine. First they made a little pair of trousers out of an old gray woolen skirt of Aunt Abigail's. This was for practice, before they cut into the piece of new blue serge that the storekeeper had sent up. Cousin Anne showed them how to pin the pattern on the goods, and they each cut out 1 piece. Those flat, queer-shaped pieces of cloth certainly did look less like a pair of trousers to Betsy than anything she had ever seen. Then one of the girls read aloud very slowly the mysterious-sounding directions from the wrapper of the pattern about how to put the pieces together. Cousin Anne helped here a little, particularly just as they were about to put the sections together wrong side up. Stashie, as the oldest, did the first basting, putting the notches together carefully, just as they read the instructions aloud, and there, all of a sudden, was a rough little sketch of a pair of knee trousers, without any hem or any waistband, of course, but just the 2-legged, complicated shape they ought to be. It was like a miracle to Betsy. Then Cousin Anne helped them sew the seams on the machine, and they all turned to for the basting of the facings and the finishing. They each made 1 buttonhole. It was the first one Betsy had ever made, and when she got through she was as tired as though she had run all the way to school and back. Tired but very proud. Although when Cousin Anne inspected that buttonhole she covered her face with her handkerchief for a minute, as though she were going to sneeze, although she didn't sneeze at all. It took them 2 Saturdays to finish up that trial pair of trousers, and when they showed the result to Aunt Abigail she was delighted. "Well, to think of that being my old skirt," she said, putting on her spectacles to examine their work. She did not laugh either when she saw those buttonholes, but she got up hastily and went into the next room, where they soon heard her coughing. Then they made a little blouse out of some new blue gingham. Cousin Anne happened to have enough left over from a dress she was making. This thin material was ever so much easier to manage than the gray flannel, and they had the little garment done in no time, even to the buttons and buttonholes. When it came to making the buttonholes, Cousin Anne sat right down with each one and supervised every stitch. You may not be surprised to know that they were a great improvement over the first batch. Then, making a great ceremony out of it, they began on the store material, working twice a week now, because May was slipping along very fast, and Mr. Pond might be there at any time. They knew pretty well how to go ahead on this one, after the experience of their first pair, and Cousin Anne was not much needed, except as adviser in hard places. She sat there in the room with them, doing some sewing of her own, so quiet that half the time they forgot she was there. It was great fun sewing all together and chattering as they sewed. A good deal of the time they talked about how splendid it was of them to be so kind to little 'Lias. "My, I don't believe most girls would put themselves out this way for a dirty little boy," said Stashie complacently. "No, indeed," chimed in Betsy. "It's just like a story, isn't it? Working and sacrificing for the poor." "I guess he'll thank us all right for sure," said Ellen. "He'll never forget us as long as he lives, I don't suppose." Betsy, her imagination fired by this suggestion, said, "I guess when he's grown up he'll be telling everybody how when he was so poor and ragged, Stashie Monahan and Ellen Peters and Elizabeth Ann—" "And Eliza," put in that little girl hastily, very much afraid she would not be given her due share of the glory. Cousin Anne sewed and listened and said nothing. Toward the end of May, 2 little blouses, 2 pairs of trousers, 2 pair of stockings, 2 sets of underwear, contributed by the teacher, and the pair of shoes Uncle Henry gave were ready. The little girls handled the pile of new garments with inexpressible pride, and debated just which way of bestowing them was sufficiently grand to be worthy the occasion. Betsy was for taking them to school and giving them to Elias one by one, so that each child could have her thanks separately. But Stashie wanted to take them to the house when Elias's stepfather would be there, and shame him by showing that little girls had had to do what he ought to have done. Cousin Anne broke into the discussion by asking, in her quiet, firm voice, "Why do you want Elias to know where the clothes came from?" They had forgotten again that she was there, and turned around quickly to stare at her. Nobody could think of any answer to her very queer question. It had not occurred to anyone that there could be such a question. Cousin Anne shifted her ground and asked another. "Why did you make these clothes, anyhow?" They stared again, speechless. Why did she ask that? She knew why. Finally, little Molly said in her honest baby way, "Why, you know why, Miss Anne, so 'Lias Brewster will look nice and Mr. Pond will maybe adopt him." "Well," said Cousin Anne, "what has that got to do with 'Lias knowing who did it?" "Why, he wouldn't know who to be grateful to," cried Betsy. "Oh," said Cousin Anne. "Oh, I see. You didn't do it to help 'Lias. You did it to have him grateful to you. I see. Molly is such a little girl. It's no wonder she didn't really take in what you girls were up to." She nodded her head wisely, as though now she understood. Well, if she did, little Molly certainly did not. She had not the least idea what everybody was talking about. She looked from one sober, downcast face to another rather anxiously. What was the matter? Apparently nothing was really the matter, she decided, for after a minute's silence Miss Anne got up with entirely her usual face of cheerful gravity and said, "Don't you think you little girls ought to top off this last afternoon with a tea party? There's a new batch of cookies and you can make yourself some lemonade if you want to." They had these refreshments out on the porch in the sunshine, with their dolls for guests, and a great deal of chatter for sauce. Nobody said another word about how to give the clothes to 'Lias, till, just as the girls were going away, Betsy said, walking along with the 2 older ones, "Say, don't you think it'd be fun to go some evening after dark and leave the clothes on 'Lias's doorstep and knock and run away quick before anybody comes to the door?" She spoke in an uncertain voice and smoothed Deborah's carved wooden curls. "Yes, I do," said Ellen, not looking at Betsy, but down at the weeds by the road. "I think it would be lots of fun." Little Molly, playing with Annie and Eliza, did not hear this, but she was allowed to go with the older girls on the great expedition. It was a warm, dark evening in late May, with the frogs piping their sweet high note, and the first of the fireflies wheeling over the wet meadows near the tumble-down house where 'Lias lived. The girls took turns in carrying the big paper-wrapped bundle, and stole along in the shadow of the trees, full of excitement, looking over their shoulders at nothing, and pressing their hands over their mouths to keep back the giggles. There was, of course, no reason on earth why they should giggle, which is, of course, the very reason why they did. If you've ever been a little girl, you know about that. One window of the small house was dimly lighted, they found, when they came in sight of it, and they thrilled with excitement and joyful alarm. Suppose 'Lias's dreadful stepfather should come out and yell at them! They came forward on tiptoe, making a great deal of noise by stepping on twigs, rustling bushes, crackling gravel under their feet, and doing all the other things that make such a noise at night and never do in the daytime. But nobody stirred inside the room with the lighted window. They crept forward and peeped cautiously inside and stopped giggling. The dim light coming from a little kerosene lamp with a smoky chimney fell on a dismal, cluttered room. A bare, greasy wooden table and 2 broken-backed chairs, with little Elias in one of them. He had fallen asleep with his head on his arm, his pinched, dirty, sad little figure showing in the light from the lamp. His feet dangled high above the floor in their broken, muddy shoes. One sleeve was torn to the shoulder. A piece of dry bread had slipped from his bony little hand, and a tin dipper stood beside him on the bare table. Nobody else was in the room, nor evidently in the darkened, empty fireless house. As long as she lives, Betsy will never forget what she saw that night through that window. Her eyes grew very hot, and her hands very cold. Her heart thumped hard. She reached for little Molly and gave her a great hug in the darkness. Suppose it were little Molly asleep there, all alone, in the dirty, dismal house, with no supper, and nobody to put her to bed. She found that Ellen next to her was crying quietly into the corner of her apron. Nobody said a word. Stashie, who had the bundle, walked around soberly to the front door, put it down, and knocked loudly. They all darted away noiselessly to the road, to the shadow of the trees, and waited until the door opened. A square of yellow light appeared, with Lai's figure very small at the bottom of it. They saw him stoop and pick up the bundle and go back into the house. Then they went quickly and silently back, separating at the crossroads with no good-night greetings. Molly and Betsy began to climb the hill to Putney Farm. It was a very warm night for May, and little Molly began to puff for breath. "Let's sit down on this rock a while and rest," she said. They were halfway up the hill now. From the rock they could see the lights in the farmhouses, scattered along the valley road and on the side of the mountain opposite them, like big stars fallen from the multitude above. Betsy sat down on the rock and looked up at the stars. After a silence, little Molly's chirping voice said, "Oh, I thought you said we were going to march up to Elias's school and give him his clothes. Did you forget about that?" Betsy gave a wriggle of shame as she remembered that plan. "No, we didn't forget it," she said. "We thought this would be a better way." "But how'll Elias know who to thank?" asked Molly. "That's no matter," said Betsy. "Yes, it was Elizabeth Ann that was who said that. And meant it, too. She was not even thinking of what she was saying. Between her and the stars thick over her in the black, soft sky, she saw again that dirty, disordered room, and the little boy all alone, asleep with a piece of dry bread in his bony little fingers. She looked hard and long at that picture, all the time, seeing the quiet stars through it. And then she turned over and hid her face on the rock. She had said her Now I Lay Me every night since she could remember. But she had never prayed till she lay there with her face on the rock, saying over and over, "Oh God, please, please, please make Mr. Pond adopt Elias." End of chapter 8.
Chapter 9 of Understood Betsy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 9. The New Clothes Fail. All the little girls went early to school the next day, eager for the first glimpse of Elias in his new clothes. They now quite enjoyed the mystery about who had made them, and were full of agreeable excitement as the little figure was seen approaching down the road. He wore the grey trousers and the little blue shirt. The trousers were a little too long, the shirt a perfect fit. The girls gazed at him with pride as he came on the playground, walking briskly along in the new shoes, which were just the right size. He had been wearing all winter a pair of cast-off women's shoes. From a distance he looked like another child, but as he came closer, oh, his face, his hair, his hands, his fingernails! The little fella had evidently tried to live up to his beautiful new raiment, for his hair had been roughly put back from his face, and around his mouth and nose was a small area of almost clean skin, where he had made an attempt at washing his face, but he had made practically no impression on the layers of encrusted dirt, and the little girls looked at him ruefully. Mr. Pond would certainly never take a fancy to such a dreadful grimy child. His new, clean clothes made him look all the worse, as though dirty on purpose. The little girls retired to their rock pile and talked over their bitter disappointment, Ralph and the other boys absorbed in a game of marbles near them. Lias had gone proudly into the schoolroom to show himself to Miss Benton. It was the day before Decoration Day, and a good deal of time was taken up with practicing on the recitations they were going to give at the Decoration Day exercises in the village. Several of the children from each school in the township were to speak pieces in the town hall. Betsy was to recite Barbara Frietchie, her first love in that school, but she droned it over with none of her usual pleasure, her eyes on little Lias's smiling face, so unconscious of his dinginess. At noontime the boys disappeared down toward the swimming hole. They often took a swim at noon, and nobody thought anything about it on that day. The little girls ate their lunch on their rock, mourning over the failure of their plans, and scheming ways to meet the new obstacle. Stashie suggested, "Couldn't your Aunt Abigail invite him up to your house for supper, and then give him a bath afterward?" But Betsy, although she had never heard of treating a supper guest in this way, was sure that it was not possible. She shook her head sadly, her eyes on the far off gleam of white where the boys jumped up and down in their swimming hole. That was not a good name for it, because there was only one part of it deep enough to swim in. Mostly it was a shallow bay in an arm of the river, where the water was only up to a little boy's knees, and where there was almost no current. The sun beating down on it made it quite warm, and even the first graders' mothers allowed them to go in. They only jumped up and down and squealed and splashed each other. But they enjoyed that quite as much as Frank and Harry. The two seventh graders enjoyed their swooping dives from the spring board over the pool. They were late in getting back from the river that day, and Miss Benton had to ring her bell hard in that direction before they came trooping up and cluttered into the schoolroom, where the girls already sat, their eyes lowered virtuously to their books. With a prim air of self-righteousness, they were never late. Betsy was reciting her arithmetic. She was getting on famously with that. Weeks ago, as soon as Miss Benton had seen the confusion of the little girl's mind, the two had settled down to a serious struggle with that subject. Miss Benton had had Betsy recite all by herself, so she wouldn't be flurried by the others, and to begin with had gone back, back to bedrock, to things Betsy absolutely knew, to the 2 times 2s and the 3 by 3s, and then, very cautiously, a step at a time, they had advanced, stopping short whenever Betsy felt a beginning of that bewildered guessing impulse which made her answer wildly at random. After a while, in the dark night which arithmetic had always been to her, Betsy began to make out a few definite outlines, which were always there, facts which she knew to be so without guessing from the expression of her teacher's face. From that moment her progress had been rapid, one sure fact hooking itself on to another, and another one on to that. She attacked a page of problems now with a zest and self-confidence which made her arithmetic lessons among the most interesting hours at school. On that day she was standing up at the board, a piece of chalk in her hand, chewing her tongue and thinking hard how to find out the amount of wallpaper needed for a room 12 feet square with 2 doors and 2 windows in it, when her eye fell on little Lias, bent over his reading book. She forgot her arithmetic. She forgot where she was. She stared and stared, till Ellen, catching the direction of her eyes, looked and stared too. Little Lias was clean, preternaturally almost wetly clean. His face was clean and shining, his ears shone pink and fair, his hands were absolutely spotless, even his hay-coloured hair was clean and, still damp, brushed flatly back till it shone in the sun. Betsy blinked her eyes a great many times, thinking she must be dreaming, but every time she opened them there was Lias, looking white and polished like a new willow whistle. Somebody poked her hard in the ribs. She started and, turning, saw Ralph, who was doing a sum beside her on the board, scowling at her under his black brows. "Quit gawking at Lias," he said under his breath. "You make me tired." Something conscious and shamefaced in his manner made Betsy understand at once what had happened. Ralph had taken Lias down to the little boy's wading place, and had washed him all over. She remembered now that they had a piece of yellow soap there. Her face broke into a radiant smile, and she began to say something to Ralph about how nice that was of him, but he frowned again and said, crossly, "Oh, cut it out! Look at what you've done there. If I couldn't 9 by 8 and get it right." How queer boys are, thought Betsy, erasing her mistake and putting down the right answer, but she did not try to speak to Ralph again about Lias, not even after school, when she saw Lias going home with a new cap on his head, which she recognized as Ralph's. She just looked at Ralph's bare head and smiled her eyes at him, keeping the rest of her face sober, the way Cousin Anne did. For just a minute Ralph almost smiled back. At least he looked quite friendly. They stepped along toward home together, the first time Ralph had ever condescended to walk beside a girl. "We got a new colt," he said. "Have you?" she said. "What colour?" "Black, with a white star, and they're going to let me ride him when he's old enough." "My, won't that be nice?" said Betsy. And all the time they were both thinking of little Lias, with his new clothes and his sweet, thin face shining with cleanliness. "Do you like spruce gum?" asked Ralph. "Oh, I love gum," said Betsy. "Well, I'll bring you down a chunk tomorrow, if I don't forget," said Ralph, turning off at the cross roads. They had not mentioned Lias at all. The next day they were to have school only in the morning. In the afternoon they were to go in a big hay wagon down to the village to the exercises. Lias came to school in his new blue serge trousers and his white blouse. The little girls gloated over his appearance and hung around him, for who was to visit school that morning but Mr. Pond himself? Cousin Anne had arranged it somehow. It took Cousin Anne to fix things. During recess, as they were playing still Pond no more moving on the playground, Mr. Pond and Uncle Henry drew up to the edge of the playground, stopped their horse, and, talking and laughing together, watched the children at play. Betsy looked hard at the big, burly, kind-faced man with the smiling eyes and the hearty laugh, and decided that he would do perfectly for Lias. But what she decided was to have little importance, apparently, for after all he would not get out of the wagon, but said he'd have to drive right on to the village. Just like that, with no excuse other than a careless glance at his watch. No, he guessed he wouldn't have time this morning, he said. Betsy cast an imploring look up into Uncle Henry's face, but evidently he felt himself quite helpless too. Oh, if only Cousin Anne had come! She would have marched him into the schoolhouse double quick. But Uncle Henry was not Cousin Anne, and though Betsy saw him, as they drove away, conscientiously point out little Lias, resplendent and shining. Mr. Pond only nodded absently, as though he were thinking of something else. Betsy could have cried with disappointment, but she and the other girls, putting their heads together for comfort, told each other that there was time enough yet. Mr. Pond would not leave town till tomorrow. Perhaps there was still some hope. But that afternoon even this last hope was dashed. As they gathered at the schoolhouse, the girls fresh and crisp in their newly starched dresses with red or blue hair ribbons, the boys very self-conscious in their dark suits, clean collars, new caps all but Ralph, and black shoes, there was no little Lias. They waited and waited, but there was no sign of him. Finally Uncle Henry, who was to drive the straw ride down to town, looked at his watch, gathered up the reins, and said they would be late if they didn't start right away. Maybe Lias had had a chance to ride in with somebody else. They all piled in, the horses stepped off, the wheels grated on the stones, and just at that moment a dismal sound of sobbing wails reached them from the woodshed back of the schoolhouse. The children tumbled out as fast as they had tumbled in and ran back, Betsy and Ralph at their head. There in the woodshed was little Lias, huddled in the corner behind some wood, crying and crying and crying, digging his fists into his eyes, his face all smeared with tears and dirt, and he was dressed again in his filthy, torn old overalls and ragged shirt. His poor little bare feet shone with a piteous cleanliness in that dark place. "What's the matter? What's the matter?" the children asked him all at once. He flung himself on Ralph, burying his face in the other boy's coat, and sobbed out some disjointed story which only Ralph could hear. And then at last and final climax of the disaster, who should come looking over the shoulders of the children but Uncle Henry and Mr. Pond, and Lias all ragged and dirty again. Betsy sat down weakly on a pile of wood, utterly disheartened. What was the use of anything? "What's the matter?" asked the two men together. Ralph turned, with an angry toss of his dark head, and told them bitterly over the heads of the children. He just had some decent clothes, first ones he ever had, and he was plotting on going to the exercises in the town hall, and that darned old skunk of a stepfather has gone and taken 'em and sold 'em to get whisky. I'd like to kill him." Betsy could have flung her arms around Ralph, he looked so exactly the way she felt. "Yes, he is a darned old skunk," she said to herself, rejoicing in the bad words she did not know before. It took bad words to qualify what had happened. She saw an electric spark pass from Ralph's blazing eyes to Mr. Pond's broad face, now grim and fierce. She saw Mr. Pond step forward, brushing the children out of his way, like a giant among dwarfs. She saw him stoop and pick little Lias up in his great strong arms, and, holding him close, stride furiously out of the woodshed, across the playground to the buggy which was waiting for him. "He'll go to the exercises all right," he called back over his shoulder in a great roar. "He'll go, if I have to buy out the whole town to get him an outfit. And that whelp won't get these clothes either. You hear me say so?" He sprang into the buggy and, holding Lias on his lap, took up the reins and drove rapidly forward. They saw little Lias again entering the town hall, holding fast to Mr. Pond's hand. He was magnificent, in a whole suit of store clothes, coat and all, and he wore white stockings and neat low shoes, like a city child. They saw him later up on the platform, squeaking out his little patriotic poem, his eyes, shining like stars, fixed on one broad, smiling face in the audience. When he finished he was overcome with shyness by the applause, and for a moment forgot to turn and leave the platform. He hung his head and, looking out from under his eyebrows, gave a quaint, shy little smile at the audience. Betsy saw Mr. Pond's great smile waver and grow dim. His eyes filled so full that he had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose loudly. And they saw little Lias once more for the last time. Mr. Pond's buggy drove rapidly past their slow-moving hay wagon, Mr. Pond holding the reins masterfully in one hand. Beside him, very close, sat Lias with his lap full of toys. Oh, full, like Christmas. In that fleeting glimpse they saw a toy train, a stuffed dog, a candy box, a pile of picture books, tops, paper bags, and even the swinging crane of the big mechanical toy dredge that everybody said the storekeeper could never sell to anybody because it cost so much. As they passed swiftly, Lias looked out at them and waved his little hand flutteringly. His other hand was tightly clasped in Mr. Pond's big one. He was smiling at them all. His eyes looked dazed and radiant. He turned his head as the buggy flashed by to call out in a shrill, exulting like shout, "Good bye! Good bye! I'm going to live with—" They could hear no more. He was gone, only his little hand still waving at them over the back of the buggy's seat. Betsy drew a long, long breath. She found that Ralph was looking at her. For a moment she couldn't think what made him look so different. Then she saw that he was smiling. She had never seen him smile before. He smiled at her as though he were sure she would understand, and never said a word. Betsy looked forward again and saw the gleaming buggy vanishing over the hill in front of them. She smiled back at Ralph silently. Not a thing had happened the way she had planned. No, not a single thing. But it seemed to her she had never been so happy in her life. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Understood Betsy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 10. Betsy has a birthday. Betsy's birthday was the 9th day of September, and the Necronset Valley Fair was always held from the 8th to the 12th, so it was decided that Betsy should celebrate her birthday by going up to Woodford, where the fair was held. The Putneys weren't going that year, but the people on the next farm, the Wendells, said they could make room in their surrey for the two little girls, for of course Molly was going too. In fact, she said the fair was held partly to celebrate her being 6 years old. This would happen on the 17th of October. Molly insisted that that was plenty close enough to the 9th of September to be celebrated then. This made Betsy feeling like laughing out, but observing that the Putneys only looked at each other with the faintest possible quirk in the corners of their serious mouths, She understood that they were afraid that Molly's feelings might be hurt if they laughed out loud, so Betsy tried to curve her young lips to the same kind and secret mirth. And I can't tell you why this effort not to hurt Molly's feelings made her have a perfect spasm of love for Molly. She threw herself on her and gave her a great hug that tipped them both over on the couch on top of Shep, who stopped snoring and his great gurgling snort wriggled out from under them and stood with laughing eyes and wagging tail, looking at them as they rolled and giggled among the pillows. "What dress are you going to wear to the fair, Betsy?" asked Cousin Anne. "And we must decide about Molly's too." This stopped their rough and tumble fun in short order. They applied themselves to the serious question of a toilet. When the great day arrived and the surrey drove away from the Wendells' gate, Betsy was in a fresh pink and white gingham which she had helped Cousin Anne make, and plump Molly looked like something good to eat in a crisp, white little dimity, one of Betsy's old dresses, with a deep hem taken in to make it short enough for the little butter ball. Because it was Betsy's birthday, she sat on the front seat with Mr. Wendell, and part of the time, when there were not too many teams on the road, she drove herself. Mrs. Wendell and her sister filled the back seat solidly full from side to side, and made one continuous soft lap on which Molly happily perched. Her eyes shining, her round cheeks red with joyful excitement, Betsy looked back at her several times and thought how very nice Molly looked. She had, of course, little idea how she herself looked, because the mirrors at Putney Farm were all small and high up, and anyhow, they were so old and greenish that they made everybody look very queer coloured. You looked in them to see if your hair was smooth, and that was about all you could stand. So it was a great surprise to Betsy later in the morning, as she and Molly wandered hand in hand through the wonders of Industrial Hall, to catch sight of Molly in a full length mirror as clear as water. She was almost startled to see how faithfully reflected were the yellow of the little girl's curls, the clear pink and white of her face, and the blue of her soft eyes. An older girl was reflected there also, near Molly, a dark-eyed, red-cheeked, sturdy little girl, standing very straight on two strong legs, holding her head high and free, her dark eyes looking out brightly from her tanned face. For an instant Betsy gazed into those clear eyes, and then, why, gracious goodness! That was herself she was looking at. How changed she was! How very, very different she looked from the last time she had seen herself in a big mirror. She remembered it well. Out shopping with Aunt Frances in a department store, she had caught sight of a pale little girl with a thin neck and spindling legs half hidden in the folds of Aunt Frances's skirt. But she didn't look even like the sister of this brown, muscular, upstanding child who held Molly's hand so firmly. All this came into her mind and went out again in a moment, for Molly caught sight of a big doll in the next aisle, and they hurried over to inspect her clothing. The mirror was forgotten in the many exciting sights and sounds and smells of their first county fair. The two little girls were to wander about as they pleased until noon, when they were to meet the Wendells in the shadow of Industrial Hall and eat their picnic lunch together. The two parties arrived together from different directions, having seen very different sides of the fair. The children were full of the merry-go-rounds, the balloon seller, the toy vendors, and the popcorn stands, while the Wendells exchanged views on the shortness of a hog's legs, the dip in a cow's back, and the thickness of a sheep's wool. The Wendells, it seemed, had met some cousins they didn't expect to see, who, not knowing about Betsy and Molly, had hoped that they might ride home with the Wendells. "Don't you suppose," Mrs. Wendell asked Betsy, "that you and Molly could go home with the Vaughans? They're here in their big wagon. You could sit on the floor with the Vaughan children." Betsy and Molly thought this would be great fun, and agreed enthusiastically. "All right, then," said Mrs. Wendell. She called to a young man who stood inside the building, near an open window. "Oh, Frank, Will Vaughan is going to be in your booth this afternoon, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am," said the young man. "His turn is from 2 to 4. "Well, you tell him, will you, that the 2 little girls who live at Putney Farm are going to go home with them? They can sit on the bottom of the wagon with the Vaughan young ones." "Yes, ma'am," said the young man, with a noticeable lack of interest in how Betsy and Molly got home. "Now, Betsy," said Mrs. Wendell, "you go round to that booth at 2 and ask Will Vaughan what time they're going to start and where their wagon is, and then you be sure not to keep them waiting a minute." "No, I won't," said Betsy. "I'll be sure to be there on time." She and Molly still had 20 cents to spend out of the 40 they had brought with them, 25 earned by berry picking, and 15 a present from Uncle Henry. They now put their heads together to see how they could make the best possible use of their 4 nickels. Cousin Anne had put no restrictions whatever on them, saying that they could buy any sort of truck or rubbish they could find, except the pink lemonade. She said she had been told the vendors washed their glasses in that, and their hands, and for all she knew their faces. Betsy was for merry-go-rounds, but Molly yearned for a big red balloon, and while they were buying that, a man came by with toy dogs, little brown dogs with curled wire tails. He called out that they would bark when you pulled their tails, and seeing the little girls looking at him, he pulled the tail of the one he held. It gave forth a fine loud yelp, just like Shep when his tail got stepped on. Betsy bought one, all done up neatly in a box tied with blue string. She thought it a great bargain to get a dog who would bark for 5 cents. Later on, when they undid the string and opened the box, they found the dog had one leg broken off, and wouldn't make the faintest squeak when his tail was pulled. But that is the sort of thing you must expect to have happen to you at a county fair. Now they had 10 cents left, and they decided to have a ride apiece on the merry-go-round, but glancing up at the clock face in the tower over Agricultural Hall, Betsy noticed it was 2:30, and she decided to go first to the booth where Will Vaughan was to be and find out what time they would start for home. She found the booth with no difficulty, but William Vaughan was not in it, nor was the young man she had seen before. There was a new one, a strange one, a careless, whistling young man with very bright socks, very yellow shoes, and very striped cuffs. He said in answer to Betsy's inquiry, "Vaughan? Will Vaughan? Never heard the name," and immediately went on whistling and looking up and down the aisle over the heads of the little girls, who stood gazing up at him with very wide startled eyes. An older man leaned over from the next booth and said, "Will Vaughan? He from Hillsborough? Well, I heard somebody say those Hillsborough Vaughans had word one of their cows was awful sick, and they had to start right home that minute." Betsy came to herself out of her momentary daze and snatched Molly's hand. "Hurry, quick! We must find the Wendells before they get away." In her agitation, for she was really very much frightened, she forgot how easily terrified little Molly was. Her alarm instantly sent the child into a panic. "Oh, Betsy, Betsy, what will we do?" she gasped, as Betsy pulled her along the aisle and out of the door. "Oh, the Wendells can't be gone yet," said Betsy reassuringly, though she was not at all sure she was telling the truth. She ran as fast as she could drag Molly's fat legs to the horse shed where Mr. Wendell had tied his horses and left the surrey. The horse shed was empty, quite empty. Betsy stopped short and stood still, her heart seeming to be up in her throat so that she could hardly breathe. After all, she was only 10 that day, you must remember. Molly began to cry loudly, hiding her weeping face in Betsy's dress. "What will we do, Betsy? What can we do?" she wailed. Betsy did not answer. She did not know what they would do. They were 8 miles from Putney Farm, far too much for Molly to walk, and anyhow neither of them knew the way. They had only 10 cents left, and nothing to eat, and the only people they knew in all that throng of strangers had gone back to Hillsborough. "What will we do, Betsy?" Molly kept on crying out, horrified by Betsy's silence and evident consternation. The other child's head swam. She tried again the formula which had helped her when Molly fell into the wolf pit, and asked herself desperately what would Cousin Anne do if she were here. But that did not help her much now, because she could not possibly imagine what Cousin Anne would do under such appalling circumstances. Yes, one thing Cousin Anne would be sure to do, of course. She would quiet Molly first of all. At this thought Betsy sat down on the ground and took the panic-stricken little girl into her lap, wiping away the tears and saying stoutly, "Now, Molly, stop crying this minute. I'll take care of you, of course. I'll get you home all right." "How'll you ever do it?" sobbed Molly. "Everybody's gone and left us. We can't walk." "Never you mind how," said Betsy, trying to be facetious and mock mysterious, though her own underlip was quivering a little. "That's my surprise party for you. Just you wait. Now come on back to that booth. Maybe Will Vaughan didn't go home with his folks." She had very little hope of this, and only went back there because it seemed to her a little less dauntingly strange than every other spot in the howling wilderness about her, for all at once the fair, which had seemed so lively and cheerful and gay before, seemed now a horrible, frightening, noisy place, full of hurried strangers who came and went their own ways, with not a glance out of their hard eyes for 2 little girls stranded far from home. The bright coloured young man was no better when they found him again. He stopped his whistling only long enough to say, "Nope, no Will Vaughan anywhere around these diggings yet." "We were going home with the Vaughans," murmured Betsy in a low tone, hoping for some help from him. "Looks as though you'd better go home on the cars," advised the young man casually. He smoothed his black hair back straighter than ever from his forehead and looked over their heads. "How much does it cost to go to Hillsborough on the cars?" asked Betsy with a sinking heart. "You'll have to ask somebody else about that," said the young man. "What I don't know about this Rube State, I never was in it before." He spoke as though he were very proud of the fact. Betsy turned and went over to the older man who had told them about the Vaughans. Molly trotted at her heels, quite comforted, now that Betsy was talking so competently to grown-ups. She did not hear what they said, nor try to. Now that Betsy's voice sounded all right, she had no more fears. Betsy would manage somehow. She heard Betsy's voice again talking to the other man, but she was busy looking at an exhibit of beautiful jelly glasses and paid no attention. Then Betsy led her away again out of doors, where everybody was walking back and forth under the bright September sky, blowing on horns, waving plumes of brilliant tissue paper, tickling each other with peacock feathers, and eating popcorn and candy out of paper bags. That reminded Molly that they had 10 cents yet. "Oh, Betsy," she proposed, "let's take a nickel of our money for some popcorn." She was startled by Betsy's fierce, sudden clutch at their little purse, and by the quaver in her voice as she answered, "No, no, Molly, we've got to save every cent of that. I've found out it costs 30 cents for us both to go home to Hillsboro on the train. The last one goes at 6 o'clock. We haven't got but 10," said Molly. Betsy looked at her silently for a moment and then burst out, "I'll earn the rest. I'll earn it somehow. I'll have to. There isn't any other way." "All right," said Molly quaintly, not seeing anything unusual in this. "You can if you want to. I'll wait for you here." "No, you won't," cried Betsy, who had quite enough of trying to meet people in a crowd. "No, you won't. You just follow me every minute. I don't want you out of my sight." They began to move forward now, Betsy's eyes wildly roving from one place to another. How could a little girl earn money at a county fair? She was horribly afraid to go up and speak to a stranger, and yet how else could she begin? "Here, Molly, you wait here," she said. "Don't you budge till I come back." But, alas! Molly had only a moment to wait that time, for the man who was selling lemonade answered Betsy's shy question with a stare and a curt, "Lord, no! What could a young one like you do for me?" The little girls wandered on, Molly calm and expectant, confident in Betsy. Betsy with a very dry mouth and a very gone feeling. They were passing by a big shed like building now, where a large sign proclaimed that the Woodford Ladies' Aid Society would serve a hot chicken dinner for 35 cents. Of course the sign was not accurate, for at 3:30, almost 4, the chicken dinner had long ago been all eaten, and in place of the dinners was a group of weary women moving languidly about, or standing saggingly by a great table piled with dirty dishes. Betsy paused here, meditated a moment, and went in rapidly so that her courage would not evaporate. The woman with grey hair looked down at her a little impatiently and said, "Dinner's all over." "I didn't come for dinner," said Betsy, swallowing hard. "I came to see if you wouldn't hire me to wash your dishes. I'll do them for 25 cents." The woman laughed, looked from little Betsy to the great pile of dishes, and said, turning away, "Mercy, child, if you washed from now till morning, you wouldn't make a hole in what we've got to do." Betsy heard her say to the other woman, "Some young one wanting more money for the side shows." Now was the moment to remember what Cousin Anne would have done. She would certainly not have shaken all over with hurt feelings, nor have allowed the tears to come stingingly to her eyes. So Betsy sternly made herself stop doing these things. And Cousin Anne wouldn't have given way to the dreadful sinking feeling of utter discouragement, but would have gone right on to the next place. So, although Betsy felt like nothing so much as crooking her elbow over her face and crying as hard as she could cry, she stiffened her back, took Molly's hand again, and stepped out, heartsick within but very steady, although rather pale without. She and Molly walked along in the crowd again, Molly laughing and pointing out the pranks and antics of the young people, who were feeling livelier than ever as the afternoon wore on. Betsy looked at them grimly with unseeing eyes. It was 4 o'clock, the last train for Hillsborough left in 2 hours, and she was no nearer having the price of the tickets. She stopped for a moment to get her breath, for, although they were walking slowly, she kept feeling breathless and choked. It occurred to her that if ever a little girl had had a more horrible birthday, she never heard of one. "Oh, I wish I could, Dan," said a young voice near her. "But honest, Mamma'd just eat me up alive if I left the booth for a minute." Betsy turned quickly. A very pretty girl, with yellow hair and blue eyes, she looked as Molly might when she was grown up, was leaning over the edge of a little canvas-covered booth, the sign of which announced that home-made doughnuts and soft drinks were for sale there. A young man, very flushed and gay, was pulling at the girl's blue gingham sleeve. "Oh, come on, Annie. Just one turn. The floor's elegant. You can keep an eye on the booth from the hall. Nobody's going to run away with the old thing anyhow." "Honest, I'd love to, but I got a great lot of dishes to wash too. You know, Mamma." She looked longingly toward the open-air dancing floor, out from which just then floated a burst of brazen music. "Oh, please," said a small voice. "I'll do it for 20 cents." Betsy stood by the girl's elbow, all quivering earnestness. "Do what, Kitty?" asked the girl in a good-natured surprise. "Everything," said Betsy compendiously. "Everything. Wash the dishes, tend the booth. You can go dance. I'll do it for 20 cents." The eyes of the girl and the man met in high amusement. "My, aren't we up and comin'?" said the man. "You're most as big as a pint cup, aren't you?" he said to Betsy. The little girl flushed. She detested being laughed at, but she looked straight into the laughing eyes. "I'm 10 years old to day," she said, "and I can wash dishes as well as anybody." She spoke with dignity. The young man burst out into a great laugh. "Great kid, what?" he said to the girl, and then, "Say, Annie, why not? Your mother won't be here for an hour. The kid can keep folks from walking off with the dope and—" "I'll do the dishes too," repeated Betsy, trying hard not to mind being laughed at, and keeping her eyes fixed steadily on the tickets to Hillsborough. "Well, by gosh," said the young man, laughing, "here's our chance, Annie, for fair. Come along." The girl laughed too, out of high spirits. "Wouldn't Mamma be crazy?" she said hilariously. "But she'll never know. Here, you cute kid, here's my apron." She took off her long apron and tied it around Betsy's neck. "There's the soap. There's the table. You stack the dishes up on that counter." She was out of the little gate in the counter in a twinkling, just as Molly, in answer to a beckoning gesture from Betsy, came in. "Hello, there's another one," said the gay young man, gayer and gayer. "Hello, Button. What you going to do? I suppose when they try to crack the safe you run at them and bark and drive them away?" Molly opened her sweet blue eyes very wide, not understanding a single word. The girl laughed, swooped back, gave Molly a kiss, and disappeared, running side by side with the young man toward the dance hall. Betsy mounted on a soap box and began joyfully to wash the dishes. She had never thought that ever in her life would she simply love to wash dishes beyond anything else. But it was so. Her relief was so great that she could have kissed the coarse, thick plates and glasses as she washed them. "It's all right, Molly, it's all right," she quavered exultantly to Molly over her shoulder. But as Molly had not, from the moment Betsy took command, suspected that it was not all right, she only nodded and asked if she might sit up on a barrel where she could watch the crowd go by. "I guess you could. I don't know why not," said Betsy doubtfully. She lifted her up and went back to her dishes. Never were dishes washed better. "Two doughnuts, please," said a man's voice behind her. Oh, mercy! There was somebody come to buy. Whatever should she do? She came forward, intending to say that the owner of the booth was away and she didn't know anything about. But the man laid down a nickel, took two doughnuts, and turned away. Betsy gasped and looked at the home-made sign stuck into the big pan of doughnuts. Sure enough, it read 2 for 5. She put the nickel up on a shelf and went back to her dish-washing. Selling things wasn't so hard, she reflected. As her hunted feeling of desperation relaxed, she began to find some fun in her new situation. And when a woman with two little boys approached, she came forward to wait on her, elated, important. 2 for 5, she said in a businesslike tone. The woman put down a dime, took up 4 doughnuts, divided them between her sons, and departed. "My!" said Molly, looking admiringly at Betsy's coolness over this transaction. Betsy went back to her dishes, stepping high. "Oh, Betsy, see the pig, the big ox!" cried Molly now, looking from her coign of vantage down the wide, grass-grown lane between the booths. Betsy craned her head around over her shoulder, continuing conscientiously to wash and wipe the dishes. The prize stock was being paraded around the fair. The great prize ox, his shining horns tipped with blue rosettes. The prize cows, with wreaths around their necks. The prize horses, 4 or 5 of them as glossy as satin, curving their bright, strong necks, and stepping as though on eggs, their manes and tails braided with bright ribbon. And then, "Oh, Betsy, look at the pig!" screamed Molly again. The smaller animals, the sheep, the calves, the colts and the pig, which waddled along with portly dignity. Betsy looked as well as she could over her shoulder, and in years to come she can shut her eyes and see again in every detail that rustic procession under the golden September light. But she looked anxiously at the clock. It was nearing 5. Oh, suppose the girl forgot and danced too long. 2 bottles of ginger ale and half a dozen doughnuts, said a man with a woman and 3 children. Betsy looked feverishly among the bottles ranged on the counter, selected 2 marked ginger ale, and glared at their corrugated tin stoppers. "How did you get them open?" "Here's your opener," said the man, "if that's what you're looking for. Here, you get the glasses and I'll open the bottles. We're in a kind of hurry. Got to catch a train." Well, they were not the only people who had to catch a train, Betsy thought sadly. They drank in gulps and departed, cramming doughnuts into their mouths. Betsy wished ardently that the girl would come back. She was now almost sure that she had forgotten, and would dance there till nightfall. But there she came, running along, as light-footed after an hour's dancing as when she had left the booth. "Here you are, kid," said the young man, producing a quarter. "We've had the time of our lives, thanks to you." Betsy gave him back one of the nickels that remained to her, but he refused it. "No, keep the change," he said royally. "It was worth it." "Then I'll buy 2 doughnuts with my extra nickel," said Betsy. "No, you won't," said the girl. "You'll take all you want for nothing. Mamma'll never miss 'em. And what you sell here has got to be fresh every day. Here, hold out your hands, both of you." "Some people came and bought things," said Betsy, happening to remember as she and Molly turned away. "The money is on that shelf." "Well, now," said the girl, "if she didn't take hold and sell things. Say," she ran after Betsy and gave her a hug, "you smart young one, I wished I had a little sister just like you." Molly and Betsy hurried along out of the gate into the main street of the town and down to the station. Molly was eating doughnuts as she went. They were both quite hungry by this time, but Betsy could not think of eating till she had those tickets in her hand. She pushed her quarter and a nickel into the ticket seller's window and said "Hillsborough" in as confident a tone as she could. But when the precious bits of paper were pushed out at her, and she actually held them, her knees shook under her and she had to go and sit down on the bench. "My, aren't these doughnuts good?" said Molly. "I never in my life had enough doughnuts before." Betsy drew a long breath and began rather languidly to eat one herself. She felt, all of a sudden, very, very tired. She was tireder still when they got out of the train at Hillsborough station and started wearily up the road toward Putney Farm. 2 miles lay before them, 2 miles which they had often walked before, but never after such a day as they now lay back of them. Molly dragged her feet as she walked and hung heavily on Betsy's hand. Betsy plodded along, her head hanging, her eyes all gritty with fatigue and sleepiness. A light buggy spun round the turn of the road behind them, the single horse trotting fast as though the driver were in a hurry, the wheels rattling smartly on the hard road. The little girls drew out to one side and stood waiting till the road should be free again. When he saw them the driver pulled the horse back so quickly it stood almost straight up. He peered at them through the twilight and then with a loud shout sprang over the side of the buggy. It was Uncle Henry. Oh, goody, it was Uncle Henry come to meet them. They wouldn't have to walk any further. But what was the matter with Uncle Henry? He ran up to them, exclaiming, "Are ye all right? Are ye all right?" He stooped over and felt of them desperately as though he expected them to be broken somewhere. And Betsy could feel that his old hands were shaking, that he was trembling all over. When she said, "Why, yes, Uncle Henry, we're all right. We came home on the cars." Uncle Henry leaned up against the fence as though he couldn't stand up. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead, and he said, it didn't seem as though it could be Uncle Henry talking, he sounded so excited. "Well, well, well, by gosh! My, well, by thunder! Now, and so you are here, and you're all right, well?" He couldn't seem to stop exclaiming, and you can't imagine anything stranger than an Uncle Henry who couldn't stop exclaiming. After they all got into the buggy he quieted down a little and said, "Thunderation! But we've had a scare. When the Wendells come back with their cousins early this afternoon they said you were coming home with the Vaughans. And then, when you didn't come we telephoned to the Vaughans, and they said they hadn't seen hide nor hair of ye, and didn't even know you were to the fair at all. I tell you, your Aunt Abigail and I had an awful turn. Ann and I hitched up quicker'n scat, and she put right out of Prince up toward Woodford and took Jessie down this way. Thought maybe I'd get trace of you somewhere here. Well, land!" He wiped his forehead again. "Wan't I glad to see you standing there. Get along, Jess. I want to get the news to Abigail soon as I can. Now tell me what in the thunder did happen to you." Betsy began at the beginning and told straight through, interrupted at first by indignant comments from Uncle Henry, who was outraged by the Wendells' loose wearing of their responsibility for the children. But as she went on, he quieted down to a closely attentive silence, interrupting only to keep Jess at her top speed. Now that it was all safely over, Betsy thought her story quite an interesting one and she omitted no detail, although she wondered once or twice if perhaps Uncle Henry were listening to her. He kept so still. "And so I bought the tickets and we got home," she ended, adding, "Oh, Uncle Henry, you ought to have seen the prize pig. He was too funny." They turned into the Putney yard now and saw Aunt Abigail's bulky form on the porch. "Got 'em, Abby. All right. No harm done," shouted Uncle Henry. Aunt Abigail turned without a word and went back into the house. When the little girls dragged their weary legs in, they found her quietly setting out some supper for them on the table. But she was wiping away with her apron the joyful tears which ran down her cheeks. Such white cheeks! It seemed so strange to see rosy Aunt Abigail with a face like paper. "Well, I'm glad to see ye," she told them soberly. "Sit right down and have some hot milk. I had some already." The telephone rang. She went into the next room and they heard her saying, in an unsteady voice, "All right, Anne, they're here. Your father just brought them in. I haven't had time to hear about what happened yet. But they're all right. You'd better come home. That's your cousin Anne telephoning from the Marshalls." She herself went and sat down heavily, and when Uncle Henry came in a few minutes later she asked him in a rather weak voice for the ammonia bottle. He rushed for it, got her a fan and a drink of cold water, and hung over her anxiously till the colour began to come back into her pale face. "I know just how you feel, Mother," he said sympathetically. "When I saw 'em standing there by the roadside I felt as though somebody had hit me a clip right in the pit of my stomach." The little girls ate their supper in a tired daze, not paying any attention to what the grown-ups were saying, until rapid hoofs clicked on the stones outside, and Cousin Anne came in quickly, her black eyes snapping. "Now, for mercy's sake, tell me what happened," she said, adding hotly, "and if I don't give that Maria Wendell a piece of my mind." Uncle Henry broke in. "I'm going to tell what happened. I want to do it. You and Mother just listen. Just sit right down and listen." His voice was shaking with feeling, and as he went on and told of Betsy's afternoon, her fright, her confusion, her forming the plan of coming home on the train, and of earning the money for the tickets, he made, for once, no Putney pretense of casual coolness. His old eyes flashed fire as he talked. Betsy, watching him, felt her heart swell and beat fast in incredulous joy. Why, he was proud of her. She had done something to make the Putney cousins proud of her. When Uncle Henry came to the part where she went on asking for employment after one and then another refusal, Cousin Anne reached out her long arms and quickly, almost roughly, gathered Betsy up on her lap, holding her close as she listened. Betsy had never before sat on Cousin Anne's lap. And when Uncle Henry finished, he had not forgotten a single thing Betsy had told him, and asked, What do you think of that for a little girl 10 years old today?" Cousin Ann opened the floodgates wide and burst out, "I think I never heard of a child's doing a smarter, grittier thing, and I don't care if she does hear me say so." It was a great, a momentous, an historic moment. Betsy, enthroned on those strong knees, wondered if any little girl had ever had such a beautiful birthday. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Understood Betsy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher. Chapter 11. Understood Aunt Frances. About a month after Betsy's birthday, one October day, when the leaves were all red and yellow, two very momentous events occurred, and, in a manner of speaking, at the very same time. Betsy had noticed that her kitten Eleanor, she still thought of her as a kitten, although she was now a big, grown-up cat, spent very little time around the house. She came into the kitchen 2 or 3 times a day, meowing loudly for milk and food, but after eating very fast, she always disappeared at once. Betsy missed the purring, contented ball of fur on her lap in the long evenings as she played checkers, or read aloud, or sewed, or played guessing games. She felt rather hurt, too, that Eleanor paid her so little attention, and several times she tried hard to make her stay, trailing in front of her a spool tied to a string or rolling a worsted ball across the floor. But Eleanor seemed to have lost all her taste for the things she had liked so much. Invariably, the moment the door was opened, she darted out and vanished. One afternoon Betsy ran out after her, determined to catch her and bring her back. When the cat found she was being followed, she bounded along in great leaps, constantly escaping from Betsy's outstretched hand. They came thus to the horse barn, into the open door of which Eleanor whisked like a little grey shadow, Betsy close behind. The cat flashed up the steep ladder like stairs that led to the hay loft. Betsy scrambled rapidly up too. It was dark up there, compared to the gorgeous coloured October day outside, and for a moment she could not see Eleanor. Then she made her out, a dim little shape, picking her way over the hay, and she heard her talking. Yes, it was real talk, quite different from the loud, imperious meow with which Eleanor asked for her milk. This was the softest, prettiest kind of conversation, all little murmurs and chirps and sing-songs. Why, Betsy could almost understand it. She could understand it enough to know that it was love talk. And then, breaking into this, came a sudden series of shrill, little needle-like cries that fairly filled the hay loft. Eleanor gave a bound forward and disappeared. Betsy, very much excited, scrambled and climbed up over the hay as fast as she could go. It was all silent now. The piercing, funny little squalls had stopped as suddenly as they began. On the top in a little nest lay Eleanor, purring so loudly you could hear her all over the big mow, and so proud and happy she could hardly contain herself. Her eyes glistened, she arched her back, rolled over and spread out her paws, disclosing to Betsy's astounded, delighted eyes, no, she wasn't dreaming. two dear little kittens, one all grey just like its mother, one grey with a big bib on his chest. Oh, how dear they were, how darling, and cuddly and fuzzy. Betsy put her fingers very softly on the grey one's head and thrilled to feel the warmth of the little living creature. "Oh, Eleanor," she asked eagerly, "can I pick one up?" She lifted the grey one gently and held it up to her cheek. The little thing nestled down in the warm hollow of her hand. She could feel its tiny, tiny little claws pricking softly into her palm. "Oh, you sweetness, you little, little baby thing," she said over and over in a whisper. Eleanor did not stop purring, and she looked up with friendly, trusting eyes as her little mistress made the acquaintance of her children. But Betsy could feel somehow that Eleanor was anxious about her kitten, was afraid that, although the little girl meant everything that was kind, her great, clumsy, awkward human hands weren't clever enough to hold a baby cat the proper way. "I don't blame you a bit, Eleanor," said Betsy. "I should feel just so in your place. There, I won't touch it again." She laid the kitten down carefully by its mother. Eleanor at once began to wash its face very vigorously, knocking it all over and over with her strong tongue. "My!" said Betsy, laughing, "you'd scratch my eyes out, if I were as rough as that." Eleanor didn't seem to hear, or rather she seemed to hear something else, for she stopped short, her head lifted, her ears pricked up, listening very hard to some distant sound. Then Betsy heard it too, somebody coming into the barn below, little quick, uneven footsteps. It must be little Molly, tagging along, as she always did. What fun to show Molly the kittens! Betsy called Molly from below. "Molly!" called Betsy from above. "Come up here quick, I've got something up here." There was a sound of scrambling, rapid feet on the rough stairs, and Molly's yellow curls appeared, shining in the dusk. "I've got a," she began, but Betsy did not let her finish. "Come here, Molly, quick, quick!" she called, beckoning eagerly, as though the kittens might evaporate into thin air if Molly didn't get there at once. Molly forgot what she was going to say, climbed madly up the steep pile of hay, and in a moment was lying flat on her stomach beside the little family in a spasm of delight that satisfied even Betsy and Eleanor, both of them convinced that these were the finest kittens the world had ever seen. "See, there are two," said Betsy. "You can have one for your very own, and I'll let you choose. Which one do you like best?" She was hoping that Molly would not take the little all grey one, because she had fallen in love with that the minute she saw it. "Oh, this one with the white on his breast," said Molly, without a moment's hesitation. "It's lots the prettiest." "Oh, Betsy, for my very own?" Something white fell out of the folds of her skirt on the hay. "Oh, yes," she said indifferently. "A letter for you. Miss Anne told me to bring it out here. She said she saw you streaking it for the barn." It was a letter from Aunt Frances. Betsy opened it, one eye on Molly to see that she did not hug her new darling too tightly, and began to read it in the ray of dusty sunlight slanting in through a crack in the side of the barn. She could do this easily because Aunt Frances always made her handwriting very large and round and clear, so that a little girl could read it without half trying. And as she read, everything faded away from before her. The barn, Molly, the kittens. She saw nothing but the words on the page. When she had read the letter through, she got up quickly, oh, ever so quickly, and went away down the stairs. Molly hardly noticed she had gone, so absorbing and delightful were the kittens. Betsy went out of the dusky barn into the rich October splendour and saw none of it. She went straight away from the house and the barn, straight up into the hill pasture toward her favourite place beside the brook, the shady pool under the big maple tree. At first she walked, but after a while she ran faster and faster, as though she could not get there soon enough. Her head was down, and one arm was crooked over her face. "And do you know I'm not going to follow her up there, nor let you go. I'm afraid we would all cry if we saw what Betsy did under the big maple tree. And the very reason she ran away so fast was so that she could be all by herself for a very hard hour and fight it out alone. So let us go back soberly to the orchard where the Putneys are, and wait till Betsy comes walking listlessly in, her eyes red and her cheeks pale. Cousin Anne was up in the top of a tree. A basket hung over her shoulder half full of striped red northern spies. Uncle Henry was on a ladder against another tree, filling a bag with the beautiful, shining, yellow-green pound sweets, and Aunt Abigail was moving around, picking up the party-coloured windfalls and putting them into barrels ready to go to the cider mill. Something about the way Betsy walked, and as she drew closer something about the expression of her face, and oh, as she began to speak, something about the tone of her voice, stopped all this cheerful activity as though a bomb had gone off in their midst. "I've had a letter from Aunt Frances," said Betsy, biting her lips, "and she says she's coming to take me away, back to them, tomorrow." There was a big silence. Cousin Anne stood perfectly motionless up in her tree, staring down through the leaves at Betsy. Uncle Henry was turned around on his ladder, one hand on an apple as though it had frozen there, staring down at Betsy. Aunt Abigail leaned with both fat hands on her barrel, staring hard at Betsy. Betsy was staring down at her shoes, biting her lips and winking her eyes. The yellow, hazy October sun sank slowly down toward the rim of Hemlock Mountain, and sent long, golden shafts of light through the branches of the trees upon this group of people, all so silent, so motionless. Betsy was the first to speak, and I'm very proud of her for what she said. She said loyally, "Dear Aunt Frances, she was always so sweet to me. She always tried so hard to take care of me." For that was what Betsy had found up by the brook under the big red maple tree. She had found there a certainty that, whatever else she did, she must not hurt Aunt Frances's feelings. Dear, gentle, sweet Aunt Frances, whose feelings were so easily hurt, and who had given her so many years of such anxious care. Something up there had told her, perhaps the quiet blue shadow of Windward Mountain creeping slowly over the pasture toward her, perhaps the silent glory of the great red and gold tree, perhaps the singing murmur of the little brook, perhaps all of them together had told her that now had come a time when she must do more than what Cousin Anne would do, when she must do what she herself knew was right, and that was to protect Aunt Frances from hurt. When she spoke, out there in the orchard, she broke the spell of silence. Cousin Anne climbed hastily down from her tree, with her basket only partly filled. Uncle Henry got stiffly off his ladder, and Aunt Abigail advanced through the grass. And they all said the same thing. "Let me see that letter." They read it there, looking over each other's shoulders, with grave faces. Then, still silently, they all turned and went back into the house, leaving their forgotten bags and barrels and baskets out under the trees. When they found themselves in the kitchen, "Well, it's supper time, anyhow," said Cousin Anne hastily, as if ashamed of losing her composure, "or almost time. We might as well get it now." "I'm a going out to milk," said Uncle Henry gruffly, although it was not nearly his usual time. He took up the milk pails and marched out toward the barn, stepping heavily, his head hanging. Shep woke up with a snort and, getting off the couch, gamboled clumsily up to Betsy, wagging his tail and jumping up on her, ready for a frolic. That was almost too much for Betsy. To think that after tomorrow she would never see Shep again, nor Eleanor, nor the kittens. She choked as she bent over Shep and put her arms around his neck for a great hug. But she mustn't cry. She mustn't hurt Aunt Frances's feelings, or show that she wasn't glad to go back to her. That wouldn't be fair, after all Aunt Frances had done for her. That night she lay awake after she and Molly had gone to bed, and Molly was asleep. They had decided not to tell Molly until the last minute, so she had dropped off peacefully, as usual. But poor Betsy's eyes were wide open. She saw a gleam of light under the door. It widened. The door opened. Aunt Abigail stood there, in her nightcap, mountainous in her long white gown, a candle shining up into her serious old face. "You awake, Betsy?" she whispered, seeing the child's dark eyes gleaming at her over the covers. I just thought I'd look in to see if you were all right." She came to the edge of the bed and set the candle down on the little stand. Betsy reached her arms up longingly, and the old woman stooped over her. Neither of them said a single word during the long embrace which followed. Then Aunt Abigail straightened up hastily, took her candle very quickly and softly, and heavily padded out of the room. Betsy turned over and flung one arm over Molly. "No, Molly, either, after tomorrow." She gulped hard and stared up at the ceiling, dimly white in the starlight. A gleam of light shone under the door. It widened, and Uncle Henry stood there, a candle in his hand, peering into the room. "You awake, Betsy?" he said cautiously. "Yes, I'm awake, Uncle Henry." The old man shuffled into the room. "I just got to thinking," he said, hesitating, "that maybe you'd like to take my watch with you. It's kind of handy to have a watch on the train, and I'd like real well for you to have it." He laid it down on the stand, his own cherished gold watch that had been given him when he was 21. Betsy reached out and took his hard, gnarled old fist in a tight grip. "Oh, Uncle Henry," she began, and could not go on. "We'll miss you, Betsy," he said in an uncertain voice. It's been real nice to have you here." And then he too snatched up his candle very quickly and almost ran out of the room. Betsy turned over on her back. "No crying now," she told herself fiercely. "No crying now." She clenched her hands together tightly and set her teeth. Something moved in the room. Somebody leaned over her. It was Cousin Anne, who didn't make a sound, Not one, but who took Betsy in her strong arms and held her close and closer, till Betsy could feel the quick pulse of the other's heart beating all through her own body. Then she was gone, as silently as she came. But somehow that great embrace had taken away all the burning tightness from Betsy's eyes and heart. She was very, very tired, and soon after this she fell sound asleep, snuggled up close to Molly. In the morning nobody spoke of last night at all. Breakfast was prepared and eaten, and the team hitched up directly afterward. Betsy and Uncle Henry were to drive to the station together to meet Aunt Frances's train. Betsy put on her new wine-coloured cashmere that Cousin Anne had made her, with the soft white collar of delicate old embroidery that Aunt Abigail had given her out of one of the trunks in the attic. She and Uncle Henry said very little as they drove to the village, and even less as they stood waiting together on the platform. Betsy slipped her hand into his, and he held it tight as the train whistled in the distance and came slowly and laboriously puffing up to the station. Just one person got off at the little station, and that was Aunt Frances, looking ever so dressed up and citified, with a fluffy ostrich feather boa and kid gloves, and a white veil over her face, and a big blue one floating from her gay flowered velvet hat. How pretty she was! And how young, under the veil which hid so kindly all the little lines in her sweet, thin face. And how excited and fluttery! Betsy had forgotten how fluttery Aunt Frances was. She clasped Betsy to her, and then started back crying. She must see to her suitcase, and then she clasped Betsy to her again and shook hands with Uncle Henry, whose grim old face looked about as cordial and welcoming as the sourest kind of sour pickle, and she fluttered back and said she must have left her umbrella on the train. "Oh, conductor, conductor, my umbrella, right in my seat, a blue one, with a crooked over oh, here it is in my hand. What am I thinking of?" The conductor evidently thought he'd better get the train away as soon as possible, for he now shouted, "All aboard!" to nobody at all, and sprang back on the steps. The train went off, groaning over the steep grade, and screaming out its usual echoing warning about the next road crossing. Uncle Henry took Aunt Frances's suitcase and plodded back to the surrey. He got into the front seat, and Aunt Frances and Betsy in the back, and they started off. And now I want you to listen to every single word that was said on the back seat, for it was a very, very important conversation, when Betsy's fate hung on the curl of an eyelash and the flicker of a voice, as fates often do. Aunt Frances hugged Betsy again and again, and exclaimed about her having grown so big and tall and fat. She didn't say brown too, although you could see that she was thinking that, as she looked through her veil at Betsy's tanned face, and down at the contrast between her own pretty, white fingers and Betsy's leather-coloured, muscular little hands. She exclaimed and kept on exclaiming. Betsy wondered if she really always had been as fluttery as this. And then, all of a sudden it came out, the great news, the reason for the extra flutteriness. Aunt Frances was going to be married. Yes, think of it. Betsy fell back open-mouthed with astonishment. Did Betsy think her Aunt Frances a silly old thing? "Oh, Aunt Frances, no!" cried Betsy fervently. You look just as young and pretty, lots younger than I remembered you." Aunt Frances flushed with pleasure and went on. "You'll love your old Aunt Frances just as much, won't you, when she's Mrs. Plimpton?" Betsy put her arms around her and gave her a great hug. "I'll always love you, Aunt Frances," she said. "You'll love Mr. Plimpton, too. He's so big and strong, and he just loves to take care of people. He says that's why he's marrying me. Don't you wonder where we are going to live?" she asked, answering her own question quickly. "We're not going to live anywhere. Isn't that a joke? Mr. Plimpton's business keeps him always moving around from one place to another, never more than a month anywhere." "What'll Aunt Harriet do?" asked Betsy wonderingly. "Why, she's ever and ever so much better," said Aunt Frances happily. "And her own sister, my Aunt Rachel, has come back from China, where she's been a missionary for ever so long, and the two old ladies are going to keep house together out in California, in the dearest little bungalow, all roses and honeysuckle. But you're going to be with me. Won't it be jolly fun, darling, to go travelling all about everywhere, and see new places all the time?" Now those are the words Aunt Frances said, but something in her voice and her face suggested a faint possibility to Betsy that maybe Aunt Frances didn't really think it would be such awfully jolly fun as her words said. Her heart gave a big jump up, and she had to hold tight to the arm of the surrey before she could ask, in a quiet voice: "But, Aunt Frances, won't I be awfully in your way, travelling around so?" Now Aunt Frances had ears of her own, and though that was what Betsy's words said, what Aunt Frances heard was a suggestion that possibly Betsy wasn't as crazy to leave Putney Farm as she had supposed. Of course she would be. They both stopped talking for a moment and peered at each other through the thicket of words that held them apart. I told you this was a very momentous conversation. One sure thing is that the people on the back seat saw the inside of the surrey as they travelled along, and nothing else. Red sumac and bronze beech trees waved their flags at them in vain. They kept their eyes fixed on each other intently, each in an agony of fear lest she hurt the other's feelings. After a pause Aunt Frances came to herself with a start, and said, affectionately putting her arm around Betsy: "Why, you darling, what does Aunt Frances care about trouble if her own dear baby girl is happy?" And Betsy said resolutely: "Oh, you know, Aunt Frances, I'd love to be with you." She ventured one more step through the thicket. "But honestly, Aunt Frances, won't it be a bother?" Aunt Frances ventured another step to meet her. "But dear little girls must be somewhere." And Betsy almost forgot her caution and burst out: "But I could stay here. I know they would keep me." Even Aunt Frances's two veils could not hide the gleam of relief and hope that came into her pretty thin sweet face. She summoned all her courage and stepped out into the clearing in the middle of the thicket, asking right out boldly: "Why, do you like it here, Betsy? Would you like to stay?" And Betsy she never could remember afterward if she had been careful enough not to shout too loudly and joyfully. Betsy cried out: "Oh, I love it here!" There they stood, face to face, looking at each other with honest and very happy eyes. Aunt Frances threw her arm around Betsy and asked again: "Are you sure, dear?" and didn't try to hide her relief, and neither did Betsy. "I could visit you once in a while when you are somewhere near here," suggested Betsy, beaming. "Oh, yes, I must have some of the time with my darling," said Aunt Frances, and this time there was nothing in their hearts that contradicted their lips. They clung to each other in speechless satisfaction as Uncle Henry guided the surrey up to the marble stepping stone. Betsy jumped out first, and while Uncle Henry was helping Aunt Frances out, she was dashing up the walk like a crazy thing. She flung open the front door and catapulted into Aunt Abigail just coming out. It was like flinging herself into a feather bed. "Oh," she gasped out, "Aunt Frances is going to be married, and travel around all the time, and she doesn't really want me at all. Can't I stay here? Can't I stay here?" Cousin Anne was right behind Aunt Abigail, and she heard this. She looked over their shoulders toward Aunt Frances, who was approaching from behind, and said, in her usual calm and collected voice, "How do you do, Frances? Glad to see you, Frances. How well you're looking. I hear you are in for congratulations. Who's the happy man?" Betsy was overcome with admiration for her coolness in being able to talk so in such an exciting moment. She knew Aunt Abigail couldn't have done it, for she had sat down in a rocking chair and was holding Betsy on her lap. The little girl could see her wrinkled old hand trembling on the arm of the chair. "I hope that means," continued Cousin Anne, going as usual straight to the point, "that we can keep Betsy here with us." "Oh, would you like to?" asked Aunt Frances, fluttering, as though the idea had never occurred to her before that minute. "Would Elizabeth Ann really like to stay?" "Oh, I'd like to, all right," said Betsy, looking confidently up into Aunt Abigail's face. Aunt Abigail spoke now. She cleared her throat twice before she could bring out a word. Then she said: "Why, yes, we'd kind of like to keep her. We've sort of got used to having her around." That's what she said. But, as you have noticed before on this exciting day, what people said didn't matter as much as what they looked. And as her old lips pronounced these words so quietly, the corners of Aunt Abigail's mouth were twitching, and she was swallowing hard. She said impatiently to Cousin Anne, "Hand me that handkerchief, Anne." And as she blew her nose, she said, "Oh, what an old fool I am!" Then all of a sudden it was as though a great fresh breeze had blown through the house. They all drew a long breath and began to talk loudly and cheerfully about the weather and Aunt Frances's trip, and how Aunt Harriet was, and which room Aunt Frances was to have, and would she leave her wraps down in the hall or take them upstairs. And in the midst of this, Betsy, her heart ready to burst, dashed out of doors, followed by Shep. She ran madly toward the barn. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she must run and jump and shout, or she would explode. Shep ran and jumped because Betsy did. To these two wild creatures, careering through the air like bright blown autumn leaves, appeared little Molly in the barn door. "Oh, I'm going to stay! I'm going to stay!" screamed Betsy. But as Molly had not had any notion of the contrary, she only said, "Of course, why not?" and went on to something really important, saying, in a very much capitalized statement, "My kitten can walk. It took 3 steps just now." After Aunt Frances got her wraps off, Betsy took her for a tour of inspection. They went all over the house first, with special emphasis laid on the living room. "Isn't this the loveliest place?" said Betsy, fervently, looking about her at the white curtains, the bright flowers, the southern sunshine, the bookcases, and the bright cooking utensils. It was all full to the brim to her eyes with happiness, and she forgot entirely that she had thought it a very poor, common kind of room when she had first seen it. Nor did she notice that Aunt Frances showed no enthusiasm over it now. She stopped for a few moments to wash some potatoes and put them into the oven for dinner. Aunt Frances opened her eyes at this. "I always see to the potatoes and the apples the cooking of them, I mean," explained Betsy proudly. "I've just learned to make apple pie and brown Betty." Then down into the stone floored milk room, where Aunt Abigail was working over butter, and where Betsy, swelling with pride, showed Aunt Frances how deftly and smoothly she could manipulate the wooden paddle and make rolls of butter that weighed within an ounce or two of a pound. "Mercy, child, think of your being able to do such things!" said Aunt Frances, more and more astonished. They went out of doors now, Shep bounding by their side. Betsy was amazed to see that Aunt Frances drew back, quite nervously, whenever the big dog frisked near her. Out in the barn Betsy had a disappointment. Aunt Frances just balked absolutely at those ladder like stairs. "Oh, I couldn't, dear. Do you go up there? Is it quite safe?" "Why, Aunt Abigail went up there to see the kittens," cried Betsy, on the edge of exasperation. But her heart softened at the sight of Aunt Frances's evident distress of mind at the very idea of climbing into the loft, and she brought the kittens down for inspection, Eleanor meowing anxiously at the top of the stairs. On the way back to the house they had an adventure, a sort of adventure, and it brought home to Betsy once for all how much she loved dear, sweet Aunt Frances, and just what kind of love it was. As they crossed the barnyard the calf approached them playfully, leaping stiff-legged into the air and making a pretense of butting at them with its hornless young head. Betsy and Shep often played with the calf in this way by the half hour, and she thought nothing of it now, hardly noticed it, in fact. But Aunt Frances gave a loud, piercing shriek, as though she were being cut into pieces. "Help! Help!" she screamed. "Betsy! Oh, Betsy!" She had turned as white as a sheet, and could not take a single step forward. It's nothing," said Betsy, rather impatiently. "He's just playing. We often play with him, Shep and I." The calf came a little nearer, with lowered head. "Get away," said Betsy indifferently, kicking at him. At this hint of masterfulness on Betsy's part, Aunt Frances cried out, "Oh, yes, Betsy, do make him go away. Do make him go away." It came over Betsy that Aunt Frances was really frightened, yes, really, and all at once her impatience disappeared, never to come back again. She felt toward Aunt Frances just as she did toward little Molly, and she acted accordingly. She stepped in front of Aunt Frances, picked up a stick, and hit the calf a blow on the neck with it. He moved away, startled and injured, looking at his playfellow with reproachful eyes. But Betsy was relentless. Aunt Frances must not be frightened. "Here, Shep! Here, Shep!" she called loudly, and when the big dog came bounding to her, she pointed to the calf and said sternly, "Take him into the barn. Drive him into the barn, sir." Shep asked nothing better than this command, and charged forward, barking furiously and leaping into the air as though he intended to eat the calf up alive. The two swept across the barnyard and into the lower regions of the barn. In a moment Shep reappeared, his tongue hanging out, his tail wagging, his eyes glistening, very proud of himself, and mounted guard at the door. Aunt Frances hurried along desperately through the gate of the barnyard. As it fell to behind her, she sank down on a rock, breathless, still pale and agitated. Betsy threw her arms around her in a transport of affection. She felt that she understood Aunt Frances as nobody else could, the dear, sweet, gentle, timid aunt. She took the thin, nervous white fingers in her strong brown hands. "Oh, Aunt Frances dear, darling Aunt Frances," she cried, "how I wish I could always take care of you!" The last of the red and gold leaves were slowly drifting to the ground as Betsy and Uncle Henry drove back from the station after seeing Aunt Frances off. They were not silent this time, as when they had gone to meet her. They were talking cheerfully together, laying their plans for the winter which was so near. "I must begin to bank the house to morrow," mused Uncle Henry. "And those apples have got to go to the cider mill, right off. Don't you want to ride over on top of them, Betsy, and see 'em made into cider?" "Oh, my, yes," said Betsy. "That will be fine. And I must put away Deborah's summer clothes and get Cousin Ann to help me make some warm ones, if I'm going to take her to school in cold weather." As they drove into the yard, they saw Eleanor coming from the direction of the barn with something big and heavy in her mouth. She held her head as high as she could, but even so, her burden dragged on the ground, bumping softly against the rough places on the path. "Look!" said Betsy. "Just see that great rat Eleanor has caught." Uncle Henry squinted his old eyes toward the cat for a moment and laughed. "We're not the only ones that are getting ready for winter," he remarked. Betsy did not know what he meant and climbed hastily over the wheel and ran to see. As she approached Eleanor, the cat laid her burden down with an air of relief and looked trustfully into her little mistress's face. Why, it was one of the kittens! Eleanor was bringing it to the house. Oh, of course, they mustn't stay out there in that cold hayloft now that the cold weather was drawing near. Betsy picked up the little sprawling thing, trying with weak legs to get around over the rough ground. She carried it carefully toward the house, Eleanor walking sinuously by her side and talking, in little singing, purring meows, to explain her ideas of kitten comfort. Betsy felt that she quite understood her. "Yes, Eleanor, a nice little basket behind the stove with a warm piece of an old blanket in it. Yes, I'll fix it for you. It'll be lovely to have the whole family there, and I'll bring the other one in for you." But evidently Eleanor did not understand little girl talk as well as Betsy understood cat talk, for a little later, as Betsy turned from the nest she was making in the corner behind the stove, Eleanor was missing, and when she ran out toward the barn she met her again, her head strained painfully back, dragging another fat, heavy kitten, who curled his pink feet up as high as he could in a vain effort not to have them knock against the stones. "Now, Eleanor," said Betsy, a little put out, "you don't trust me enough. I was going to get it all right." "Well," said Aunt Abigail, as they came into the kitchen, "now you must begin to teach them to drink." "Goodness!" said Betsy. "Don't they know how to drink already?" "You try them and see," said Aunt Abigail with a mysterious smile. So when Uncle Henry brought the pails full of fragrant, warm milk into the house, Betsy poured out some in a saucer and put the kittens up to it. She and Molly squatted down on their heels to watch, and before long they were laughing so that they were rolling on the kitchen floor. At first the kittens looked every way but at the milk, seeming to see everything but what was under their noses. The grey kin, that was Betsy's, absent-mindedly walked right through the saucer, emerging with very wet feet and a very much aggrieved and astonished expression. Molly screamed with laughter to see him shake his little pink toes and finally sit down seriously to lick them clean. Then White Bib, Molly's, put his head down to the saucer. "There, mine is smarter than yours," said Molly. But White Bib went on putting his head down, 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 clear into the milk nearly up to his eyes, although he looked very frightened and miserable. Then he jerked it up quickly and sneezed and sneezed and sneezed, such deliriously funny little baby sneezes. He pawed and pawed at his little pink nose with his little pink paw until Eleanor took pity on him and came to wash him off. In the midst of this process she saw the milk, and left off to lap it up eagerly, and in a jiffy she had drunk every drop and was licking the saucer loudly with her raspy tongue. And that was the end of the kitten's first lesson. That evening, as they sat around the lamp, Eleanor came and got up in Betsy's lap, just like old times. Betsy was playing checkers with Uncle Henry, and interrupted the game to welcome the cat back delightedly. But Eleanor was uneasy, and kept stopping her toilet to prick up her ears and look restlessly toward the basket, where the kittens lay curled so closely together that they looked like one soft ball of grey fur. By and by Eleanor jumped down heavily and went back to the basket. She stayed there only a moment, standing over the kittens and licking them convulsively, and then she came back and got up in Betsy's lap again. "What ails that cat?" said Cousin Anne, noting this pacing and restlessness. "Maybe she wants Betsy to hold her kittens too," suggested Aunt Abigail. "Oh, I'd love to," said Betsy, spreading out her knees to make her lap bigger. "But I want my own white bib myself," said Molly, looking up from the beads she was stringing. "Well, maybe Eleanor would let you settle it that way," said Cousin Anne. The little girls ran over to the basket and brought back each her own kitten. Eleanor watched them anxiously, but as soon as they sat down she jumped up happily into Betsy's lap and curled down close to little Greykin. This time she was completely satisfied, and her loud purring filled the room with peaceable murmur. "There, now you're fixed for the winter," said Aunt Abigail. By and by, after Cousin Anne had popped some corn, old Shep got off the couch and came to stand by Betsy's knee to get an occasional handful. Eleanor opened one eye, recognized a friend, and shut it sleepily. But the little kitten woke up in terrible alarm to see that hideous monster so near him, and prepared to sell his life dearly. He bristled up his ridiculous little tail, opened his absurd little pink mouth in a soft baby "ss," and struck savagely at old Shep's good-natured face with a soft little paw. Betsy felt her heart overflow with amusement and pride in the intrepid little morsel. She burst into laughter, but she picked it up and held it lovingly close to her cheek. What fun it was going to be to see those kittens grown up! Old Shep padded back softly to the couch, his toenails clicking on the floor, hoisted himself heavily up, and went to sleep. The kittens subsided into a ball again. Eleanor stirred and stretched in her sleep, and laid her head in utter trust on her little mistress's hand. After that Betsy moved the checkers only with her other hand. In the intervals of the game, while Uncle Henry was pondering over his moves, The little girl looked down at her pets, and listened absently to the keen autumnal wind that swept across the old house, shaking the shutters and rattling the windows. A stick of wood in the stove burned in two and fell together with a soft, whispering sound. The lamp cast a steady radiance on Uncle Henry, bent seriously over the checker board, on Molly's blooming round cheeks and bright hair, on Aunt Abigail's rosy, cheerful, wrinkled old face, and on Cousin Ann's quiet, clear dark eyes. That room was full to the brim of something beautiful, and Betsy knew what it was. Its name was happiness. End of Chapter 11. End of Understood Betsy by Dorothy Canfield Fisher.